More than a century later, the dress remains behind thick glass, still standing intact. The champagne-colored silk has inevitably aged, and the heavy gold threads have tarnished. Yet, those thousands of beetle wings continue to cast a cold, brilliant light across the decades. History carved the proud viceroy's name deeply into enduring marble. But for the woman who sacrificed her youth and her body to illuminate his path, the empire preserved almost nothing. What remained was a collection of lifeless insect wings. Mary Leiter was born on May 27, 1870, in Chicago. It was a city where vast fortunes were being built at extraordinary speed, and one that would soon be reshaped by fire. In her early teenage portrait, her eyes are steady and unsmiling. Her father's signature on property documents suggests the scale of the world she was born into. He had partnered with Marshall Field years before the Great Chicago Fire, and the business expanded further after the city rebuilt. His accumulated wealth was soon calculated in the tens of millions of dollars. That difference mattered because the fire became part of Chicago's mythology, not the entire source of the Leiter's rise. Mary was not born into the long-inherited silk of European dynasties. Her financial foundation came from trade, real estate, and the hard instincts of a rapidly rising America. Washington completed the lesson Chicago had started. In that city, money mattered. But manners decided who stayed in the room after introductions ended. Mary learned how power spoke when it was confident enough not to hurry. She watched hostesses, diplomats, and political wives treat conversation as a form of ranking, and she absorbed the method quickly. She grew up inside a lavish mansion on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington and moved in the same official social world as Frances Folsom Cleveland. Yet, for her deeply ambitious mother, raw capital was never the final destination. Stacks of banknotes were merely a crude instrument. Money was required to purchase something infinitely more permanent and unassailable. It had to buy historical recognition. The new money needed to be laundered into ancient prestige. The American elite realized that true aristocratic authority could not be built from scratch in a single generation. It had to be carefully acquired across the ocean, utilizing whatever immense financial leverage they currently possessed to secure it. But the sprawling mansions of Chicago, and even the powerful political corridors of the American capital, could not contain the profound sense of greatness expanding inside this young woman. Tall for her milieu and hard to ignore, she carried herself with unusual physical confidence. In those early high society gatherings, she moved with slow, deliberate confidence. There was no trace of frantic eagerness or desperate flattery when she walked into a crowded ballroom. She often lowered her eyelashes and listened rather than competing for the center of attention. The established elite usually expected a newly wealthy American girl to be excessively loud, to flaunt heavy, tasteless jewelry, and to exhibit a desperate thirst for immediate social validation. Mary executed the exact opposite strategy. That restraint did not make her weak. It made her harder to read. And in rooms where every family was measuring every other family, mystery could work better than display. She let older names underestimate her, then answered with composure instead of noise. Her reserve gave her a presence that others in the room had to adjust to. She did not need to shout to demonstrate her inherent authority. Her stillness made people treat her as if she already belonged. It forced the most powerful rooms to automatically rearrange their rigid social hierarchy around her quiet, observing figure. The Chicago Tribune specifically noted her distinct lack of aggressive self-confidence, praising her engaging sympathy instead. She completely shattered the vulgar, predictable stereotype of the new money American heiress. She deeply desired a vast, consequential existence that perfectly matched the immense depth of her own internal landscape. She proved that true magnetic power is never loud or begging for external approval. It is the absolute, quiet certainty that you already belong exactly where you are standing, patiently waiting for the entire world to finally realize your own true, undeniable historical worth. During the late 19th century, the global elite established a ruthless but perfectly functional transactional formula. America possessed bottomless bank accounts, while Europe retained ancient aristocratic titles. The calculating frown on Mary's mother's face revealed her meticulous social strategy as she coldly crossed the bourgeois French nobility off her primary target list. She demanded the absolute highest echelon of power. Carefully arranged, embossed invitations to British royal gatherings sat on a vanity table. Mary did not stumble into the old world as a desperate, blind social climber. She executed a flawless, impeccably timed curtsy before the Prince and Princess of Wales in London, officially signaling her triumphant arrival. She was launched into this highly exclusive arena, utilizing a sophisticated campaign heavily loaded with millions of dollars in sheer financial ammunition. Yet, raw capital only purchased the initial introduction. She fiercely held her ground and conquered this intimidating social battlefield using her own inherent dignity, razor-sharp wit, and flawless diplomatic instincts. The notoriously snobbish London aristocracy initially tried to ignore her, but they were ultimately forced to bow their heads and fully accept her commanding presence. The old European world had opened its doors to her, but that entrance was only the beginning of a much harsher bargain. It also placed her within reach of the greatest risk of her life. Because right in the middle of those ancient rooms stood a man carrying an ambition large enough to swallow the world and swallow her along with it. What mattered in London was not only wealth but control. Too much eagerness exposed an outsider immediately. Mary seemed to understand that before many people around her did. She moved through titled rooms without begging to be admitted by them, and that posture made even old families pause. It also made her more visible to a man like Curzon, who was always drawn to usefulness hidden inside poise. Around 1890, Mary first encountered the formidable George Nathaniel Curzon. He was a 31-year-old man with cold eyes, clearly destined to dominate others. A faint, chilling scrape of metal came from beneath his perfectly tailored suit jacket whenever he moved. A rigid steel corset tightly clamped his curved spine, forcing him to stand painfully straight. A signature, arrogant smirk often played across his pale face as he navigated confidently through elite London crowds. Curzon embodied the self-confidence and hardness of the British Empire at its height. He had already crossed the deserts of Persia, penetrated the borders of Afghanistan, and authored heavy books on geopolitics. He understood the mechanics of colonial power intimately. His arrogance was legendary, so much so that Oxford students mocked him in verse. Yet, this towering public greatness was maintained only by hiding his extreme bodily torment every single day. Mary did not fall in love with an easy man. She fell in love with one whose ambition, pain, and arrogance were tightly bound together. He was a rising member of Parliament who viewed the world as a chessboard, waiting for his next aggressive move. She saw the immense physical pain driving his relentless ambition. Other women might have retreated from his freezing intellect. Mary recognized a structure she could reinforce. She looked past the arrogant public facade and saw the terrible, hidden agony required to sustain his superiority over others. Mary tumbled into a profound, undeniable love swiftly and deeply. However, breaking down the defenses of a man entirely trapped within his own massive ego demanded an extraordinary level of patience. Hundreds of private letters passed between them over 2 long years of courtship. At formal dinners, she calmly neutralized the frozen, suffocating atmospheres Curzon regularly generated. His boundless arrogance and severe lack of basic empathy constantly alienated powerful, influential peers across London. It is vital to establish the factual truth. Mary did not simply purchase George Curzon with her father's immense wealth. She won him over through steadiness, intelligence, and emotional discipline. She provided exactly the radiant warmth that his austere private chambers always lacked. She supplied the supreme diplomatic softness necessary to mend the valuable political relationships his sharp tongue routinely severed. She became one of the essential supports beneath his ambition. Furthermore, she possessed the truly unique capacity to soothe his hidden physical suffering while simultaneously elevating his colossal pride. Curzon was notoriously difficult to impress or please. It took him 2 full years to finally realize that this American heiress was the vital missing component his political trajectory desperately required. He did not view her as a mere financial transaction. He eventually recognized her as an intellectual equal who could navigate the complex social machinery he often broke through sheer blunt force. That recognition did not soften him completely. It simply made him see that Mary could do what many allies could not. She could steady a room after he had chilled it, and she could translate ambition into manners people were willing to accept. They officially became engaged in 1893. Her quiet grace acted as the perfect counterbalance to his chilling superiority. By choosing to submit to her stabilizing influence, he secured the exact partner needed to fund and facilitate his global ascendance. She had won over the man Oxford had mocked as the superior person, proving that her quiet strategy was more effective than his loud dominance. On April 22, 1895, these 2 disparate worlds were formally bound together inside a Washington church. The 24-year-old bride flashed a sparkling, triumphant smile across the front pages of the international press. However, behind the glamorous headlines lay the cold reality of a prenuptial agreement. A cold, decisive signature authorized the immediate, irrevocable transfer of an enormous fortune from America to England. This massive financial injection erased all of the groom's debts and paved a golden road for his future power. At 35, Curzon stood at the altar with his ambitious eyes already fixed firmly on a distant horizon. Viewed exclusively from the outside, the public framed this union as a modern Cinderella story. Yet, as biographer Nigel Nicholson later pointed out, this was a very specific fairy tale where Cinderella's father happened to be worth $20 million. Mary had undeniably won the grand prize. She secured the most brilliant, sought-after man in Great Britain. But the brutal tragedy of her impending life began on this exact day. She had successfully captured George Curzon, but George Curzon was a man who possessed no internal mechanism to halt his own bottomless greed. The glittering wedding band that slipped onto her finger served merely as the initial down payment. What Curzon craved next was the highest imperial office he could reach. Only 4 years later, that reckless hunger became a dark reality, placing Mary on a stage large enough to exhaust her completely. On January 6, 1899, the massive vessel carrying the newly appointed viceroy dropped anchor in the harbor of Bombay. Mary Leiter Curzon stood on the deck, 28 years old, and noticeably pregnant with her first child. The moment the heavy iron doors of the ship swung open, a suffocating wave of tropical heat struck her face like a physical blow. Blinding dust swirled through the air, heavy with the sharp scent of spice, salt, and dry earth. Beneath a blazing, relentless sun, a deafening sea of human voices roared from the docks, stretching as far as the eye could see. Mary was not simply an obedient wife packing her bags to accompany her husband to a distant, exotic outpost. She was being dropped directly into the cruel, fast-moving nerve center of the entire British Empire. The title of Vicereine transformed this young woman from Chicago into the visible consort of imperial authority in India. She now stood at the apex of a caste system, ruling over a subcontinent of 300 million subjects. The role was public before it was personal. Every procession, greeting, and review turned her body into part of the state itself. That was the bargain few outsiders could fully see. She was not simply learning India. She was learning how empire used a woman's appearance, composure, and energy to turn distance into authority. The sheer, terrifying scale of this administrative and symbolic dominion was entirely unprecedented. It expanded far beyond the financial world her father had built in the Midwest. It also dwarfed the managed social world she had learned to navigate in Washington and London. Colonial governance had a new face, and Mary was forced to shoulder its staggering weight from her very first step on the shore. As the royal train moved slowly toward Calcutta, the journey became a public test. Hundreds of thousands of eyes turned toward the foreign woman inside it. The British colonial elite were watching, waiting for the wealthy American heiress to commit a catastrophic social error. Mary refused to grant them that satisfaction. Sitting in an open-top state carriage, her posture was braced perfectly straight, unyielding against the exhaustion of the journey. Her steady, unblinking gaze swept across a massive crowd of over 100,000 people lining the streets, instantly silencing the cynical smirks of the observers on the balconies. Some newspapers quickly described her as the most beautiful Memsahib in Asia. An Indian poet even welcomed her in court verse, framing her arrival in language of beauty and imperial awe. She mastered the intricate, exhausting choreography of the vice-regal court without a single misstep, moving through ancient palaces as though she had been born to the purple. For Mary, the performance began before she had time to understand the country beneath it. Every greeting, procession, and dinner required a calculated stillness. One misplaced gesture could confirm every prejudice the colonial elite already held against an American woman in imperial office. Yet, this public triumph carried a cruel trap beneath its glittering surface. To the British Empire, Mary was no longer an independent human being with private vulnerabilities. She had been turned into a polished symbol of imperial majesty, within this rigid hierarchy of power, an imperial symbol was explicitly denied the basic human right to be weak. Public life left almost no room for weakness. She could not show fatigue. She could not admit physical weakness. To preserve the illusion of effortless supremacy, she had to surrender any real private life. Behind the closed doors of the palace, far from the grand public spectacles and glittering state dinners, the Vicereine confronted a relentless, crushing schedule of official labor. Mary refused to operate as a mere ornament for her husband's career. Her fine silk shoes were frequently caked in heavy mud as she walked miles to inspect local hospitals, rural dispensaries, and newly established schools. She spent hours over a crowded desk, her notebook filled with detailed figures as she personally managed budgets to expand medical education and professional training for Indian women. She collaborated directly with local weavers, running her fingers over exquisite fabrics to promote traditional Indian craftsmanship. By incorporating their ancient embroidery techniques into her own official court dresses, she successfully forced the fashion houses of Paris and London to recognize the genius of these indigenous artists. Her daily life was an unending cycle of diplomatic audiences with maharajas, military reviews under the baking sun, and exhausting administrative correspondence. She was deeply committed to these philanthropic projects, working with genuine devotion to ease the suffering of the population. That work gave her a practical role inside a court built on display. It also placed her in a difficult position. The people she tried to help were still living under the authority of the same system that used her image to soften its rule. Yet, the cold structural reality of the British Raj remained absolute. No matter how much benevolence Mary injected into her daily rounds, her personal excellence was ultimately serving a predatory system. Her kindness softened the public face of colonial rule without changing its structure. She had become one of the empire's most visible faces. But this structure was already driving its weight into her failing body. Lord Curzon's ambition required a grand stage. She paid for that ambition with her health. In the year 1903, seeking to properly celebrate the coronation of King Edward VII, George Curzon meticulously orchestrated an ostentatious event entirely without historical precedent. The deafening roar of thousands of massive elephants echoed across the vast plains, their thick hides draped in heavy gold ornaments and blinding jewels. Dozens of ruling princes appeared before an enormous crowd gathered under the Delhi sun. This specific gathering, famously known as the Delhi Durbar, was not merely a diplomatic necessity. It functioned as the absolute, undistorted reflection of Curzon's own profound inner psychology. It revealed his terrifying grandiosity, his absolute obsession with microscopic control, and his insatiable hunger to project ultimate authority. He successfully transformed a massive, ancient subcontinent into a carefully directed visual spectacle designed specifically to satisfy his own ego. He wanted the empire to witness his command over this vast territory. The empire was watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. To anchor the center of this unprecedented stage, he required a flawless leading lady. He needed a pristine visual instrument, a woman capable of absorbing the immense pressure of millions of staring eyes without breaking her composure. Mary was positioned to become the ultimate symbol of imperial dominance, standing directly beside a man who viewed himself as the supreme architect of colonial history. To meet the impossible demands of this brutal imperial pageant, Mary actively collaborated to design a garment that violently pushed the accepted boundaries of contemporary fashion. Indian artisans worked for long hours in the crowded Kishan Chand workshop in Delhi. They rapidly drove thousands of piercing needles through heavy champagne-colored silk, executing the ancient, physically demanding art of Zardozi embroidery using genuine gold and silver thread. Their fingers worked tirelessly to construct a masterpiece. At the center of the peacock feather motifs were iridescent beetle wing cases. They were not constructed from polished emeralds or imported precious stones. The brilliant shifting color came from the actual wing cases of the jewel beetle, known scientifically as elytra. A haunting, iridescent blue-green light radiated outward from these meticulously arranged fragments of dead insects. The finished embroidered panels were shipped from India to Paris. There, the House of Worth completed the final assembly. This dress represented the ultimate, undeniable intersection of global power dynamics. The labor behind the surface did not disappear, but the final object made that labor easy to forget. By the time the panels reached Paris, the hands that made them had already been pushed into the background of an imperial costume. It was built on Indian craftsmanship and then finished to serve a European imperial display. Utilizing the hardened husks of beetles rather than expensive gemstones served as the perfect, deeply brutal metaphor for the British Empire itself. From a comfortable distance, the glowing fabric appeared overwhelmingly rich and blindingly powerful. Yet, its fundamental structural foundation was woven entirely from tiny captured lives that had been systematically crushed and repurposed for display. The garment's beauty depended on labor that disappeared behind the finished spectacle. When the heavy silk, the thick metallic threads, and the thousands of insect wings were finally assembled together, the completed garment weighed a truly staggering 10 pounds. She was putting on a garment heavy enough to strain the body wearing it. The physical toll of simply standing upright while carrying this massive weight would be immense, requiring extraordinary discipline to successfully conceal the severe physical pain. The highly anticipated night of January 6, 1903, finally descended over the Diwani-Khas, the historic hall of private audience located within the Red Fort of Delhi. The loud, chaotic murmurs of thousands of gathered aristocrats and wealthy diplomats ceased instantly, dropping into an absolute, breathless silence in just a fraction of a single second. Thousands of flickering candles cast a warm, dancing light against the flawless diamonds of Mary's Boucheron tiara and her heavy necklace. The suffocating 10-pound weight of shimmering beetle wings and dense metallic thread pressed down aggressively upon the young woman's slender frame. The entire cavernous hall watched in stunned fascination. Mary held the room with extraordinary control, appearing less like a guest than the center of the spectacle itself. This specific, awe-inspiring moment marked the absolute zenith of her authority, the most radiant and powerful instant of her tragically brief existence. Standing quietly in a dark, isolated corner of the grand hall, George Curzon watched her slow progress. His piercing eyes reflected a profound, cold satisfaction with the flawless living masterpiece his empire now proudly possessed. But not a single person standing in that glittering, entirely silent room recognized the horrific truth. Beneath that heavy silk, A body already under strain was paying a physical price no one in the hall could see. The exorbitant physical price extracted by that single night of absolute supremacy triggered a truly agonizing, irreversible slide deep into the very darkest of isolated rooms. After the Durbar, Mary's headaches became severe and persistent. Thick, heavy velvet curtains were pulled completely shut inside the massive Calcutta palace, effectively blocking out the blinding, aggressive tropical light. The only sound remaining in her sprawling bedroom was the shallow, labored breathing of a woman confined to her mattress, lying completely motionless for weeks at a time. Outside her darkened door, the colossal administrative machinery of the viceroyalty ground onward without a single pause. The scorching tropical climate of India and a diplomatic schedule that offered absolutely zero accommodation for physical weakness had finally cornered her. This profound exhaustion did not strike her down in one sudden dramatic blow. Instead, it wore her down gradually, draining her vital energy day after day. In the year 1903, she was repeatedly bedridden, yet she refused to complain. Having been educated from childhood to believe that silent endurance was the ultimate feminine virtue, Mary simply clenched her teeth and maintained her absolute silence. She absolutely refused to become a burdensome invalid, terrified that her failing health might obstruct the rapid, aggressive ascent of her husband's career. Her silence was a deliberate choice to protect his political trajectory. She willingly absorbed the punishing physical cost of their shared ambition, allowing the empire to wear her down from within, while she maintained a flawless public facade. The singular, fragile avenue of escape for the couple was a tiny, secluded retreat hidden high upon the windy slopes of Mashobra. In the mountain retreat at Mashobra, the formal shells of their public life loosened for a time. They reverted to a simple, quiet intimacy, whispering their private nicknames, Kinky and Pappy, to one another. Mashobra did not remove the pressure, but it changed the scale of it. The rooms were smaller, the air cooler, and the constant performance briefly loosened. For Mary, even a temporary reduction in ceremony could feel like a rare form of privacy. That pattern would define the rest of her time in India. Brief tenderness interrupted a structure that never truly changed. Curzon could miss her, admire her, and depend on her, but he still treated the office as non-negotiable. Mary was left to manage that contradiction in silence. She had become necessary to his equilibrium without ever becoming important enough to slow his plans. It was one of the exceedingly rare places where George Curzon allowed his punishing steel corset to be temporarily loosened. In this quiet isolation, the surviving historical record confirms beyond any doubt that he truly loved her with all of his highly complicated heart. When her health forced her to return to England alone, he wrote to her repeatedly. In those letters, he admitted that he felt adrift without her steadying presence. However, the most savage tragedy of their relationship lies precisely within this dynamic. His love never became strong enough to slow his ambition. He needed her desperately to maintain his balance, but he absolutely refused to stop using her. By the year 1904, Mary's private letters clearly stated her strong premonition that returning to India would be a terrible mistake for both of them. Despite her explicit warnings and her visibly deteriorating condition, George Curzon stubbornly bullied his way into securing an unprecedented second term as viceroy. His insatiable hunger for supreme authority blinded him to the reality of her physical decline. He brought her back into imperial life despite her condition, prioritizing his own historical legacy over the physical survival of the only woman he claimed to cherish above everything else. Her fears proved justified on English soil just before they were due to return east. During the autumn of 1904, the faces of the top medical specialists gathered at Walmer Castle in Kent grew terribly pale and covered in a cold sweat. Blood continually soaked through the heavy bed linens following a severe, life-threatening maternity complication. Mary's core body temperature plummeted drastically as she hovered precariously on the razor-thin border of survival. She was rushed into a highly dangerous emergency surgical procedure, but a massive systemic infection spread rapidly through her already compromised and deeply weakened system. She fought desperately for her breath and narrowly escaped the cold grave. But she would permanently and irrevocably lose her prior physical health. The fundamental resilience of her biological system had officially surrendered to the tremendous pressure placed upon it over the previous 5 years. Yet, the ruthless, unyielding obligations of colonial duty and George Curzon's towering, uncompromising ambition mercilessly dragged that shattered physical vessel right back to the eastern furnace. Even after Walmer, duty still pulled her back into the same imperial routine. But even that political throne was about to collapse. By then, her body was already drained. When imperial politics shifted against Curzon, that betrayal became the final blow. The severe physical destruction she bravely endured at Walmer Castle was merely the tragic precursor to the complete and utterly humiliating obliteration of their shared imperial dream. Later accounts recalled a striking moment when Mary stood completely still, like a statue, upon the banks of the Yamuna River. A long, dark shadow stretched across the water, cast by the massive marble structure of the Taj Mahal under the pale silver moonlight. She spoke quietly into the still air with an emotionless whisper that simply vanished into the void. She stated plainly that she would welcome immediate death if it meant securing a magnificent marble mausoleum equal to the one standing before her. George Curzon was currently investing massive resources into the extensive restoration of the Taj Mahal. He aggressively cleared away decades of decay and meticulously repaired its sprawling gardens. He was actively chiseling his own name into the permanent historical record, using thousands of tons of immortal white marble. Meanwhile, Mary was writing her name across the exhausted years she had surrendered, etching it into a body already carrying deep physical scars. He was dedicating his life to constructing monuments that honored a glorious imperial past. She, however, had become a diminished figure inside the life she was still expected to perform. The empire had divided their legacies. He was still chasing immortality through stone. She was left to face deterioration in her own body. Beside the river, she could already imagine the end approaching her before it ever reached him. But the sprawling authority of George Curzon was not remotely as stable as the immortal marble blocks he so deeply revered. His immense power was ruthlessly shattered by a single military general. The struggle with Kitchener unfolded through memorandums, bureaucratic conflict, and public humiliation. Curzon had foolishly engaged in a vicious public bureaucratic war with Lord Kitchener, the notoriously ruthless commander-in-chief of the Indian Army. They were locked in a bitter struggle over the absolute administrative control of the colonial military system. Curzon presented razor-sharp, highly precise analytical arguments that were fundamentally correct on paper. Yet raw political machinery rarely protects those arrogant men who have systematically alienated all of their natural allies. In August 1905, Prime Minister Arthur Balfour and the calculating British government in London coldly voted to support Kitchener. They officially sided with the military hero over the unpopular administrator. Curzon was immediately and permanently stripped of his actual governing authority. Having lost the crucial backing of his own superiors, he was forcefully compelled to submit a formal letter of resignation. His absolute humiliation was broadcast across the entire global empire. His humiliation was public, and it exposed how little control he still had within the system he revered. He had spent years treating the subcontinent as his own personal kingdom, completely ignoring the basic rules of political survival. Now the very system he worshipped had turned around and discarded him like a broken tool. He was definitively defeated, completely disgraced, and rendered utterly powerless by the exact same imperial structure that he had so proudly commanded just a few short months prior. On November 18, 1905, the massive steamship carrying the disgraced former viceroy quietly slipped its heavy moorings and departed India. The docks were empty, and the departure felt less like ceremony than retreat. There were no military honor guards standing at attention. No traditional brass bands played any ceremonial anthems to formally mark their departure. George Curzon stood rigidly alone on the wooden deck. He was quietly muttering a specific line from his own recent farewell speech in a desperate attempt to salvage his rapidly rotting dignity. He had boldly claimed in public that he had written his name there and that the letters were a living joy. That grandiose statement sounded magnificent and poetic to Curzon himself, but it represented a brutal insult to the frail woman standing silently beside him. He had lost his office, his public honor, and his political purpose. Mary, however, had lost something even harder to recover: her health and the years spent supporting him. She had sacrificed 6 vital years of her youth and exhausted her entire reserve of biological survival energy solely for the benefit of this empire. Ultimately, that deeply treacherous colonial machinery simply turned around and expelled her husband like a worthless liability. They packed their heavy trunks and sailed back toward the grim, suffocating fog of London. The polluted London air offered her no comfort or real chance of recovery. One of them returned home merely to face a bitter, frustrating period of political exile. The other returned home to find that recovery was slipping out of reach. The relentless summer heat of the coming year was already waiting quietly in the shadows to claim its final, tragic victory over her completely broken physical body. The palatial residence at Carlton House Terrace could not provide any sudden medical miracle to save her. Mary's physical resistance had been stretched to its absolute final limit. The summer of 1906 descended upon London with an unusually oppressive heavy heat that offered no relief. Inside her quiet bedroom, the atmosphere became chillingly still at exactly 40 minutes past 5 in the afternoon on July 18th. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the pendulum clock gave way to a permanent, interrupted silence across her chest. The death certificate listed heart failure as the final cause, describing it as the sequel of a serious illness 2 years earlier. Her heart did not simply stop due to some unpredictable, isolated disease suddenly dropping from the sky. It was the end point of damage her body had been carrying for years. It was the final consequence of 6 relentless years inside Imperial life. She had carried both the visible glory of the empire and the political ambition of her husband on her shoulders. The temperate English climate had no power to reverse or cleanse the profound systemic destruction that India had already carved deep into her bone marrow. She died at the age of 36. She carried an entirely depleted, exhausted lifetime down into the cold earth with her. By then, the empire had taken more from her body than it could ever return, leaving behind a body that could no longer recover. George Curzon collapsed beside her deathbed. The most notoriously arrogant man in England finally tasted the bitter salt of his own tears. After her death, Curzon commissioned sketches and plans for a memorial in white marble. The effigies closed. Still eyes lay inside the freezing ancient chapel at Kettleston Hall. The historical record demands a strict acknowledgement of a highly complex truth regarding their marriage. Curzon loved her with a genuine, agonizing intensity. He dedicated 7 full years of his life to constructing that elaborate memorial tomb to honor her memory. Yet, the governing laws of male aristocratic power are profoundly ironic and ruthlessly pragmatic. Devastating personal grief does not interrupt the grinding machinery of political ambition. Within less than a single year after the tragic funeral, he initiated a highly publicized new romantic relationship with Eleanor Glynn. He eventually remarried, officially taking Grace Elvina Hines as his second wife. He later became Foreign Secretary and helped reshape global borders. In 1923, he came close to becoming Prime Minister of Great Britain. Curzon was granted a full 19 additional years on Earth to build his legacy. Society allowed the widower to continue a public life of power and consequence. Mary lost that fundamental privilege forever. She was frozen in white marble and sealed into a rural chapel. The man she had helped elevate kept moving forward. He comfortably retained his immense political power, his wealth, and his boundless future. The devastating reality of her premature death was ultimately absorbed as a highly manageable footnote within the sweeping narrative of his own triumphant and celebrated biography. Her rapid departure left 3 young daughters suffocating and entirely unanchored within the colossal, overbearing shadow of their father. Little Alexandra was still only a child when her mother died. Years later, those same daughters, once grown, were forced to sign dense legal documents and battle in court to secure their rightful inheritance from their American grandfather. It was a massive fortune that their own biological father had deliberately locked away. When Mary vanished, no one remained who could soften Curzon's brutal dictatorial tendencies. He heavily restricted his children's lives and their inherited wealth through a severe pattern of psychological control. Irene, Cynthia, and Alexandra were carelessly tossed into a scandal-ridden British society, completely lacking a maternal compass. Cynthia would later marry Oswald Mosley and die at the age of 34. They were permanently deprived of the single individual capable of protecting them from the cruel authoritarianism operating directly inside their own family structure. Every single biological element of Mary Leiter Curzon eventually dissolved into silent dust. Yet, the historical record chose a deeply unsettling method of preserving her memory. What survived most visibly was not the woman herself, but the object that symbolized her public role. Stone kept his office visible, while fabric preserved only her display. The balance between those two memorials says something harsh about the system they lived inside. His memory stayed attached to rank and policy. Hers was left attached to appearance and sacrifice. And now, when we step into that ancient estate, we do not meet the warm voice of a mother. We meet a cold, glittering relic. Over 100 years have passed. The dress remains inside a glass case at Kettleston Hall, still intact more than a century later. The original champagne silk has yellowed deeply. The heavy gold thread has rotted into a blackened ruin. Yet, thousands of iridescent beetle wings still cast a blinding cold light, piercing effortlessly through the century. History meticulously carved his proud vice-regal name into eternal marble. But for the woman who sacrificed her youth and body to illuminate his path, the empire preserved almost nothing. What remained was a collection of lifeless insect wings.